Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Demetra Nightingale at the Urban Institute, and I'm pleased to welcome all of you who are joining us today from across the country for this forum on achieving job quality. Along with Pamela Loprest, I co-direct the Good Jobs Project here at the Urban Institute. We're jointly sponsoring this event today with our Urban Institute WorkRise colleagues. Before we get a few housekeeping notes. The event is being recorded. The recording and relevant links will be posted online after the event. All participants are muted. We have closed caption turned on today. If you'd like to adjust your settings for closed caption, click the live transcription button, which is usually at the bottom in Zoom. Type in any questions or comments that you might have into the questions box anytime throughout the event. We'll be collecting and trying to address them after each panel. If you'd like to join the conversation on Twitter, please use the hashtag #live@urban. We have a very full program today, but first I want to just quickly say a couple of words to get us started. The Good Jobs Project is now in its second year of research, and this is the latest in a number of public forums and events that we've had. With funding from the Gates Foundation, we focus on various dimensions of what a good job is. What does it mean? And how does a good job relate to or contribute to upward economic mobility? We have several reports. For example, one lays out a framework for thinking about job quality. Another is a review of existing evidence, and then gaps in data and research that should be filled in order to move forward. A new report on racial equity and job quality will be coming out very soon. As you will hear today, there are many different perspectives and opinions about what a good job is, and there are some complex issues to unravel. So to help do that, we have three facilitated panels today. First, Kimberly Brown from the Gates Foundation will provide some introductory comments just to give us some context. Then Molly Scott from the Urban Institute will introduce and moderate the first panel on exploring job quality and going beyond just looking at wages. The second panel will give us some worker perspectives on job quality, and that will be moderated by Lakeitha Furby, Executive Director of Strive of New York. Finally, Elizabeth Jacobs, a Senior Fellow at the Urban Institute and a Principal in WorkRise, will moderate our third panel on the future paths for job quality. Now I'd like to introduce Kimberly Brown. Kim is a Senior Program Officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and for more than 15 years, she has worked on initiatives promoting economic mobility through education, workforce development, and philanthropy. She also specializes in developing industry partnerships and leveraging data to inform workforce development programming and investment. Earlier in her career, Kim taught English language learners and developed employment-focused programs for refugees, survivors of domestic violence and human trafficking, and other people with high barriers to employment. She previously was also a Chief Program Officer at DC Central Kitchen, where she focused on food justice, social enterprise, and workforce development for people experiencing poverty, incarceration, addiction, and homelessness. Kim has a BA in linguistics from University of Montana and a master's degree in curriculum and instruction from the University of Maryland. Truly a broad thinker and a broad active policy analyst. Now I'll turn it over to you, Kim.
All right, thanks, Demetra. Hopefully everyone can hear me all right. I really want to thank the Urban team for hosting us and to everybody for contributing to this discussion. As Demetra mentioned, my name is Kim Brown and I work on a strategy at Gates called Economic Mobility and Opportunity. And our goal is really to increase the economic security and opportunities for upward mobility for about 26 million or so American workers who are living at less than 200% of the federal poverty line and who are not enrolled in traditional credentialing educational institutions right now. And our team's approach to this work to improve the population's economic mobility has taken shape in a few different ways that we're focused on access to public benefits, job training and upskilling, and increasing access to good jobs among some other aspects of our strategy. But like Demetra mentioned, before joining the foundation, I've always worked with folks who faced really high barriers to success, like folks returning from incarceration, refugees, as she mentioned, peoples whose families have suffered from generational poverty. And so what I found is people just want to be able to have one good job that they can work at to support their families. And so this issue of job quality for me is really personal and super important. And I've been really happy to be able to engage with the Urban Institute on this issue thus far. And so today, I know we're going to get a lot out of the discussion today. I'm really excited about the potential for us and for today to serve as a space, a shared space where we can all align on what a good job is and how job quality can contribute to economic mobility. I'm really excited too for us to understand more deeply the perspectives of workers. And I appreciate all the work that Urban and Lakeitha from Strive have done to elevate the critical voices of workers in this session for us today. And I just can't stress how important that is to me and how much I appreciate the work that's been done there. Our team at the foundation is still relatively new to this job quality space, but we have some fundamental perceptions about the good jobs movement, we'll call it the good jobs movement, that drive our strategy. We think that good jobs are critical ingredients in an individual's upward mobility journey. And I've seen that in my own practice be absolutely true. The good jobs movement today is full of deeply thoughtful folks, like many of you who are on the call today and who are listening and who are speaking, who advocate for good jobs and are elevating multiple distinct but often complementary definitions of what a good job is. And we're really interested in how we can achieve some alignment here with these differing definitions of job quality. Similarly, I think members of the Good Jobs movement advocate for a variety of different strategies for bringing impact of our shared work to scale. So we're interested in figuring out ways that we can advance this work and achieve a scaled impact. And we think that the collective impact of the Good Jobs movement has the potential to positively change the experiences and quality of life for millions of workers. At the foundation and what drives the strategy that we're promoting, we're really grappling with some challenging questions that I hope we can get some insights into today. One of those is that given the diversity and breadth of definitions of good jobs in the field, is there a mutually agreed, mutually prioritized definition that we all share and that we could advance together? What is the most effective strategy we can use to bring the good jobs movement to impact at scale? So what would it take for every one of the 26 million workers that I mentioned who are right now working in poverty to have a good job? And related to that, can this movement achieve scaled impact via voluntary strategies? Or do we have to depend on public action and public policy? And finally, what data do we need? And this is where Urban is super important to us. What data do we need and what data can we make available to folks in the field that allows us to understand which jobs are good, allows us to create accountability and to drive research into how good jobs ultimately drive individuals' economic mobility. And we're really interested ultimately in what role philanthropy might play. Obviously, as a representative of the Gates Foundation, we want to know, how we can help to align the field and advance this job quality movement for workers. We've got some ideas as specific answers to these questions. Maybe we should start with a couple of different practices and see if we can scale that up quickly and see if we can get some uptake with businesses offering high quality jobs. Or maybe we focus on, elements of job quality where there's high quality and broadly available data. We're not really sure where we should focus yet, but we hope that the insights generated via this convening will give us some insights. And we're also, as I said, really interested in data, and maybe the most important kind of prerequisite for scaling in our mind is kind of an internal push to make good data broadly available to the field so we can make decisions about job quality. So that's just a little bit about why I'm in this space and why we've, partnered with Urban on this work and some of my thoughts about goals and what we might accomplish today. I'm really excited to hear from everybody on the panel, particularly the worker experience. And so can't wait to get started, and thanks to everyone for participating. And I think I'm going to throw it back to Demetra at this point.
Thank you, Kim, for those great comments. It was very useful for us to hear the context that we're moving forward in. Now for our first panel, moderated by Molly Scott. Molly is Principal Research Associate in the Center for Income and Benefits Policy here at the Urban Institute. Her work centers on systems and systemic changes needed to ensure that all people are valued for their skills and abilities in education, labor market, and society. Molly also has led research projects, especially recently, in collaboration with employers to document forward-thinking practices in hiring and advancement for frontline workers. She has a master's in public policy from UCLA. Again, thanks to all of you for joining us today, and please submit comments and questions in the Q&A section of Zoom as you wish. I turn it over to you, Molly.
Thanks, Demetra, and thanks, Kimberly, for your remarks. It was a really great way to sort of set the stage for this first panel that's really focused on being a holistic discussion on what it means to have a good job. But before we get started, I wanted to welcome our distinguished guests on the panel, all of whom who have dedicated their careers to improving jobs and workers' lives in various different ways. First of all, we have Pranita Gupta, who is a special assistant to President Joe Biden for labor and workers at the Domestic Policy Council. In this role, Pranita advises the president on policies to improve job quality, strengthen worker protections, and increase family economic security. She's spent more than 2 decades advocating for better labor standards, practices, and opportunities for low-wage workers, and was most recently Director of Job Quality at CLASP, the Center for Law and Social Policy. So welcome, Pranita. Our next panelist is Arnie Kalberg, who is the Keenan Distinguished Professor of Sociology at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. His research focuses on the nature of work and job quality in the United States, Europe, and Asia. Over his decades-long career, he has written extensively on the emergence of non-standard work arrangements, the precarity of work, growing job polarization, and impacts on families and communities. So welcome, Arnie. Next, we have Sarah Kullock, who is the Executive Director of the Good Jobs Institute, an organization that helps companies thrive by creating good jobs. She builds partnerships with companies and investors and creates tools and resources to guide businesses looking to achieve success by improving job quality. In 2018, she served as a Job Quality Fellow with the Aspen Institute. Welcome, Sarah. And lastly, we have Debbie King, who is a senior advisor at the National Domestic Workers Alliance, a coalition of grassroots organizations dedicated to transforming the domestic work sector through worker organizing, leadership, policy development, and narrative change. Debbie has spent more than 5 decades advocating on behalf of workers. And for more than a decade, she served as executive director of the Service Employee International Union's Training and Employment Funds. And she's led high-profile campaigns and negotiations for childcare funding and paid leave family policies. So welcome, Debbie. So thank you all for being with us today. We're super lucky to have you all. So again, this is about thinking about how we should define what's a good job, right? And here at the Urban Institute, we've been doing some work on that as well. We, as Demetra mentioned, we have sort of a framing paper that talks about a bunch of different dimensions of job quality. A lot of the public debate focuses on wages and benefits, right? Like health insurance, but we know that there are other dimensions that are important as well. Working conditions, during the pandemic, the whole health and safety element has really risen to the top as being of great importance. There's job security and scheduling, non-discrimination. The things about business culture, having a sense of purpose in your work, a sense of belonging, feeling included, for diversity and inclusion in the workplace. There are things about jobs design, right? The diversity of tasks you have that allow you to develop skills that are marketable and reimbursable. And then there are things around opportunities for skill development, education, training, advancement at work, career pathways, all of those things. So we have all these different sort of elements and complexities around jobs. Arnie, you've been studying job quality and the workplace for decades now. What are your insights into what elements of jobs are really most critical to the quality of that experience for workers?
Well, thanks, Molly. And I must say, you've mentioned quite a few key elements of what might be considered good jobs. Let me just start by saying that if there's a large element of individual differences in terms of defining what a good job is. What might be a good job for me might not be considered a good job for you, and vice versa. In fact, I think it's easier to define what is not a bad job rather than to define what a good job is, because the opposite of bad is not necessarily good in this case. But let me give you a few things that have emerged from the research on this. The first, of course, is wages. We live in a society in which people need to make money through paid work. And so wages, of course, are a critical aspect of a good job. How much a wage depends on the individual person, the individual's family circumstance, the person's life stage, and so on. And related to that, because we live in a society in which we have developed a system in which employers deliver benefits, in particular healthcare and health insurance and pensions. This is a very unusual system worldwide, by the way, but it's the way it is in America. And until we get universal healthcare and until we get universal pension coverage, having these things in a job is very important. But there are other things that are important as well, and we've noticed them more and more recently. One is control over one's work schedule. The idea that having enough flexibility and enough predictability to take care of what you need to take care of in your life is critical. And that's also very critical for trying to achieve some sort of balance and between work and family, and in order to cope with family lives. This has become more and more important as we see more dual earner couples now and dual earner families. So that's a critical aspect of it. And not having control over your schedule produces a great deal of stress, and it produces a lot of problems. Related to that, though, is control over what you do at work, autonomy over work tasks. Now, not everybody wants autonomy over work tasks. Some people are perfectly happy being told what to do, and as long as they have a safe working environment and are well paid, they're okay with it. But research has shown that having control over what you do and being able to make decisions and exercise autonomy is a very critical factor in your psychological functioning and in your development as a human being. And I guess the other aspect I would think is really important is it's not so much the characteristic of the job, but it's more of a career aspect of it. People need to have hope for the future. And so to have jobs that provide you with opportunities for advancement to other better jobs, for example, is critical. And here, the idea of training is very important, that people need to have training. They have to get skill acquisition, because you don't learn what you need to do on the job at school. Typically, you learn maybe some skills at school that might help you to be able to learn better skills, but it's really training, which is a key to advancement opportunities. The COVID pandemic also has underscored the importance of having a safe and healthy work environment. This is something that many of us have taken for granted, but has become critical. And many of the folks who have been termed essential workers have been exposed to these dangerous work environments, which is very, very negative. Whereas people like academics and white collar workers have been able to do things like Zoom and so on. Having said those things, these are all job related characteristics. They're characteristics of the individual in relation to the job. But let me just say two more things. One is many of these things are within the control of employers. Employers have options as to how they want to design work. There is not a determinism about this. Employers can design jobs that give workers control over their schedule, control over what they do. They can pay them decent wages. These are all under the control of employers, provided they are incentivized to do so. And finally, there are some things that are beyond the control of employers. And I think the best example here is something like healthcare. The idea that employers are responsible for providing healthcare is an historical accident in the United States that occurred in the late 40s, when employers couldn't raise wages, and so they provided additional things to encourage workers, and that led to the growth of health insurance provisions. But not everybody gets that. So these are the various levers that will affect the degree to which people have these quality of jobs. And so I look forward to our conversation about not only the characteristics of jobs that affect job quality, but also how those things can be implemented.
Thank you for that, Arnie. Now, Pranita, Arnie alluded a little bit to the importance of opportunities for advancement, right? And we know that there are particular elements of job that may be more conducive to advancement or not. What are your perspectives on that in terms of, what matters in terms of achieving greater economic mobility for workers? And secondly, how is the administration thinking about job quality and its various economic proposals?
Thanks so much, Molly. And I just want to echo a lot of what Arnie said in his presentation. I want to start actually by thanking the Urban Institute and WorkRise for inviting me to present on this panel today. This topic is really timely, since President Biden is deeply committed to improving the quality of jobs and ensuring all workers have pathways to the middle class. That's why I'm excited to share the different ways the president has centered job quality in the policies that his administration has introduced in the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan. A fundamental value undergirding these proposals is worker voice and the right to organize, join a union, and collectively bargain. This is a critical mechanism to ensure greater job quality. For example, in the American Jobs Plan, the president is calling on Congress to create new, good quality union jobs that pay prevailing wages in safe and healthy workplaces while ensuring workers have a free and fair choice to organize and join a union. That plan includes passing the Protecting the Right to Organize Act and guaranteeing union and bargaining rights for public service workers. The president's plan also ensures domestic workers receive the legal benefits and protections they deserve, and to tackle pay inequities based on gender. The plan's also focused on creating good jobs. The president's plan demands that employers benefiting from the investments in the American Jobs Plan follow strong labor standards and remain neutral when their employees seek to organize a union and bargain collectively. He's also calling for investments tied to project labor and community workforce, local hire, and registered apprenticeship and other labor management training programs so that federal investments support good jobs and pathways to the middle class. He's also calling on Congress to put $400 billion towards expanding access to quality, affordable home or community-based care for aging relatives and people with disabilities. These investments will help hundreds and thousands of Americans finally obtain long-term services and supports they need, while also creating new jobs and offering caregiving workers a long overdue raise, stronger benefits, and an opportunity to organize or join a union and collectively bargain. Lastly, the American Jobs Plan also protects workers. In it, the president's calling on Congress to provide the federal government with the tools it needs to ensure employers are providing workers with good jobs. This includes jobs with fair and equal pay, safe and healthy workplaces, and workplaces free from racial, gender, and other forms of discrimination and harassment. As part of this plan, the president is proposing a $10 billion investment in enforcement. He's also calling for increased penalties when employers violate workplace safety and health rules. So these are just a few of the critical ways the administration has been thinking about job quality and working to actualize it.
Thank you.
So
That's really helpful. Now, employers may have a very different perspective on what it means to offer good jobs to their employees. Sarah, you're doing a lot of work on the ground with companies that may be trying to transition from maybe lower road approaches to higher road approaches to jobs. Can you speak a little bit to how employers think about job quality in your experience?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Molly. And it's great to be here with all of you. So at Good Jobs Institute, we've worked with more than 15 companies to improve job quality. And we've talked to scores of others who are at various stages of a good jobs journey. And, employers are increasingly acknowledging job quality, both because of this cataclysmic last year and the pressure, I think, on businesses to change, but also because they're starting to see how material it is to their business. And that materiality could not be more visible than it is right now, as companies are just struggling to hire. Right. And by the way, this was a problem before COVID when we had a really tight labor market. So job quality is really central to many companies' ability to succeed. So there's a lot of work going on by employers, and there's also a really long way to go in defining job quality. And for us, the devil's really in the details. So I'm going to give you a few examples of where companies fall short of job quality definitions and metrics when they are measuring them. Arnie mentioned wages, and of course, this is critical for workers. Many companies measure wages, but they're looking at market wages. And if you're in a low wage industry, like we work with, retail, restaurants, hospitality, senior care, you may be making a market wage and meeting a market wage for your workers, but that is not going to be a living wage. So when we work with companies, we do a living wage assessment with them using the MIT living wage calculator, which again is super detailed. It gets the living wage by county, by family size, really detailed methodology. And this is often, very often, the first time a company has ever looked at living wages for their workers. But even there in the living wage calculator, you've got to get into the details. So the living wage is based on a 40-hour work week. So you can't just look at the hourly wage, you have to look at stable schedules, which again are super important for job quality. Many workers don't get 40 hours even if they are full-time. So you got to really dig in. And in terms of definitions, even a living wage, it is truly a subsistence wage. It does not include savings for retirement, for education, for emergencies. And so we really want employers to see a living wage as a floor and not a ceiling. And one employer is doing that. PayPal is really leading here. They've created a new metric called NDI, non-disposable income. So they figure out what the sort of basket of living wage that you need to make ends meet, and then they add to it. They want to put a flexible buffer in, and that's that non-disposable income. And they'd like to get to 20%. They're almost there, and they're doing fantastic work. Benefits, again, mentioned multiple times today. We work with companies and they give us a long list of benefits, right? From retirement and healthcare to gym discounts and Fitbits, but you got to go deeper. You've got to look at access and uptake and equity. So we're working with one company right now, and they're frontline workers, they're a retailer. So most of their workers are frontline. 4% have even a little bit saved for retirement, only 4%, and only 6% are accessing their health benefits because they're too expensive. So you've really got to dig in. All of these can also be disaggregated by race and gender, which I think is incredibly important and incredibly helpful. Arnie mentioned training. You can say our workers get 20 hours of training, but we know in high turnover environments, your training day, you may be put right on the floor, right? Because you don't have enough staff to train you properly. So you got to dig in. Two more, employee ownership. That's really big right now. We worked with one hospitality company that was an ESOP, and all the employees had, we're an ESOP, ask me about it on their shirt. And so we did. And most could not explain to us what it really was. They were in a high turnover environment. So 100% turn every year, which means just about every person is new. And when you combine that environment with long vesting periods and ESOPs, 3, 4, 5 years, that ownership and that wealth creation, they don't happen in the same way that you think. So just having an ESOP isn't enough to create ownership. And
can you explain what an ESOP is for some of our listeners who may not be familiar with that acronym?
Sure, it's an employee stock ownership program. So it gives employees stock in the company, and these can be set up in multiple different ways. But excellent thing to look up. But it alone is not sort of necessary or sufficient to provide good jobs. Thanks for that. And finally, a lot of companies that we work with use employee surveys, and that's sort of how they measure job quality. And for us, I think there's just so many more hard metrics that you can look at. We've had companies who say we've got 90% of people who are thrilled to work here, but they also have 90% turnover. So there's something going on there where you've really got to dig in. So lots of room for movement, lots of room for improvement, and also I think way more resources than ever before for companies who really want to do job quality work. So we have launched the Worker Financial Wellness Initiative with PayPal, Just Capital, and the Financial Health Network. And this is asking CEOs from the top companies in the country to do a worker financial wellness assessment. Leaders like Chobani, Prudential have signed on. We have many more signing on. So this is really the time to dig into some of those job quality metrics for employers.
That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that perspective, Sarah. Now, we've mostly been discussing good jobs for the people who businesses recognize as direct employees, right? But I want to ask Debbie, how should we be thinking about what it means to have a good job for, our growing group of folks in our economy who are independent contractors or gig workers and don't fall into that, category of the folks who would be working for some of the businesses that Sarah was naming. Can you speak to that, Debbie?
Yes, well, first of all, I want to say that it's not necessarily true that because someone is classified as an independent contractor that they're not really an employee. And there have been litigation and legislation in a number of states about that because of employers taking people who really meet the definition of an employee, but calling them an independent contractor. And I think that that is one of the reasons that you see people being in low-wage jobs, because when you move from being an employee to being an independent contractor, you're not guaranteed any hours, you're not guaranteed minimum wage, you don't have vacations, you don't have sick leave, you don't have holidays. And in terms of our safety net legislation, you don't have the employer paying for Social Security, you don't have workers' comp, you don't have unemployment insurance, you don't have disability, you're not covered by OSHA. So when we talk about job quality, as we see a movement to more independent contractors, either through gig or through employers who in-person employer are changing people to independent contractors, I think this is a big issue. So one is the question of, are people misclassified, and what can we do to see that people who are legitimately employees are classified as employees? And secondly, if we see this growth in independent contractors, should independent contractors have some of the rights and benefits of an employee? Arnie was talking about, national health insurance, so that would cover everyone, hopefully. But what about other things like paid time off, vacation, that if you are a independent contractor, you can get unemployment insurance, which we did as part of the Recovery Act. Is that something that should be general? But I know that every time I had somebody coming to my house delivering Instacart, I was thinking about what is the difference between that person and an employee and all the things that that person doesn't have that are part of a quality job. And going back to the whole question of the PRO Act, of course, independent contractors do not have the right to organize and therefore do not have a voice at work, which is very, very important in terms of both wages and conditions and the way people are treated. So should independent contractors be able to unionize? And I think these are some big questions as we see growth in this type of workforce that we really need to address if we're concerned with job quality.
Thanks, Debbie. So now I'd kind of like to open it up to the whole panel. We have some sort of big picture questions to sort of reflect on. The first one is, should we have a broader definition of job quality for purposes of policy advocacy and research? You can imagine that there's some pros and cons to that, right? In some ways, it might be more difficult to organize around if we're thinking about job quality in a broader way. But at the same time, you might be able to build sort of unexpected coalitions between workers and employers on particular aspects of what it means to have a good job. I want to throw it out to the panel. What are your thoughts about using this a broader definition of job quality in this space?
So I definitely think we need a broader definition of job quality because it's so important and central to people's lives. At the same time, my research has shown that the wage is a pretty good indicator of the quality of the job. Low wage jobs tend to be bad on many dimensions. The opposite is not so much true. But I also think that there's going to be big challenges for this, because while employers can pay wages that are higher, other things affect the way they organize their work, like schedule control and the amount of control they have over their tasks. And that makes it, that really challenges what used to be called management prerogative. So it's a more challenging activity as far as management goes.
Yeah, so I will agree with Arnie. I think we absolutely have to have a broad definition for job quality. And I don't want that to take away from the centrality of wages for low wage workers. So again, when we work with companies, we had one who was so excited about their benefits, and they told us about their discounted ski passes. They were a senior living company and they were paying CNAs low wages, and these CNAs had 2 and 3 jobs, right? So we really need to be able to focus on wages and many of the other aspects that make jobs good for employees, but also for employers. So, at Good Jobs Institute, we help companies look at their job design and their operations and figure out how to make different choices so they can really drive productivity, contribution, motivation of, these fantastic essential frontline workers. So we're talking about wages. I think that's scary for employers, but there's absolutely a path to higher wages that can drive service and drive productivity. So this is not a zero-sum game. Good jobs are also good for business.
I just want to say that I in no way want to take away the responsibility from employers for providing good jobs, but I think some of the responsibilities for our society, when Arnie was talking about the whole question of flexibility because of balancing work family, really the question of what kind of supports do we give to people now that we have either single people supporting a family or dual wage earners, again, somewhat new, 30, 40 years, right? We don't provide the supports for a family to work. And it used to be that you worked to help your family. Now working is interfering with caring for your family. So we need to have childcare. We need to have the kind of elder care that the Biden administration is talking about, where people at higher incomes can get elder care. And we need to have paid family leave. And those kinds of things would really help us to make it easier for employers to provide good jobs, because some of these things are really very difficult for an individual employer. And I would underline Arnie's point about national health care. We're the only industrialized country that doesn't have it. And I think work-family benefits, something I'm passionate about, it's also a very important thing that should be provided to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to echo my fellow panelists on this. We also believe you need to have a broader definition of job quality than wages, especially if you want to achieve greater equity and, again, ensure greater worker voice. The benefit is that when you use a more holistic approach, it can really lead to long-term systemic change rather than just tinkering on the edges. When we think about good jobs, we're thinking of those that not only provide family-sustaining wages, but actually allow for wage progression and benefits, offer critical supports like access to paid leave, opportunities for career advancement through training and education, and an assurance, again, that workers can use their voice to improve their pay and working conditions. All of that is necessary. And all of that's really necessary if we are to undo some of the structural racism and persistent economic inequities that have really undermined opportunity for millions of workers, especially women and people of color.
Thank you for that. And actually, that's a great transition to my next question, which really goes to the issues of equity, right? We know that workers of color and women are disproportionately hold low quality jobs, right? How could addressing these other aspects for this, job quality in a more holistic way, how could that help correct racial and gender labor market disparities? Folks want to comment on that?
I just want to underline the PRO Act in terms of, this idea that people are in low wage jobs. It's not that the jobs are not worth getting paid more. I mean, I come from originally the healthcare industry where certainly home care workers who are doing very, very difficult work of caring, for example, people with Alzheimer's whose families can't care for them, and they're still, making $9 or $10 an hour. It's not that the work is not skilled. In many cases, it's that the workers don't have the power to get the wages that they deserve. And I was just chatting with my grandson the other day, and we're talking about the auto workers and the fact of people having homes in the country in Michigan and their children going to college. And my grandson was saying, well, was that work much more skilled at that point? And I said, no, the workers had power to be able to get decent wages. And I think this is something we really have to understand. It's really like a light bulb that it's not that the work that people do is so unskilled. It's that they don't have the power to get decent wages. And we need to change that. I think the PRO Act is one of the things, if we pass that act, that in itself would do a tremendous amount. And we talk about employer opposition to unions. If employers want quality jobs, employers should support the right of their employees to have a union.
Debbie, I'm so glad you brought up unskilled work. So we're about to release a paper in the next 2 weeks that looks at the history of why some work is called unskilled. And you will not be at all surprised that it has, racist and sexist origins, right? So work primarily done by people of color or women was immediately called unskilled, regardless of the content of the work. And, direct care work continues to be called unskilled, and it is incredibly skilled and deeply important work. So we've got to work on that. And, over the last year, so many companies have made big DEI commitments, hundreds of millions of dollars. And we've got to figure out what, how do we hold those companies accountable? How do they hold themselves accountable? What do we think about as real impact? And so for me, absolutely, board and leadership diversity is hugely important. And I can't think of anything a company could do that is more important than ensuring that all of their employees, and especially people of color, women, diverse workers, have quality jobs. And so all of the ways that we define a quality job, they can all be disaggregated by race and gender and all sorts of different metrics. And I think, that is just an incredibly important part of any diversity, equity, inclusion journey, is getting to racial and gender equity.
That's the perfect actually transition to one of the questions that came from the audience, right? Which is, how do we leverage this moment, right? We've had quite a year. There's been a renewed focus on racial injustice, racial equity. And at the same time, you have employers now struggling to hire and all of these things, right? How do we leverage that, that energy for more long-term, more systemic and scalable change in terms of job quality? Do folks have thoughts on that?
Well, I think we should remember who the essential workers were during this pandemic. And many of these essential workers are those workers who were working or are working in so-called unskilled jobs, low-wage jobs. But these are the folks that kept us going during this pandemic, the folks who worked in the grocery stores, who took care of our families, who delivered food, who picked up our garbage. These are the essential workers, and we should remember that essential implies that they should be rewarded appropriately. And so we shouldn't forget that. And I think that's one way we can keep the momentum of the pandemic going.
Other thoughts on that?
I don't want to be partisan here, but basically, we're hearing about what the Biden administration wants to do to address these issues. And basically, we have to see that Republican senators support the Biden administration's plan. And really, it's political. I mean, when we see the division that we actually have one party that I would say is against the things that we need for job quality.
So I know.
Sorry, I was just going to add that.
Appropriate, but I mean, I really think that it's the elephant on the table when we're talking about some of these things.
So I was just going to add, the pandemic really laid bare the structural inequities in our economy. And that's why, the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan focus on policies that will really increase opportunities and strengthen the support workers need in order to achieve greater economic security. And two of the main strategies, which others have on the panel have also touched upon, which I think are so critical, is workforce development and education opportunities and critical work family supports. So, in the American Jobs Plan, it includes a historic investment of $100 billion in workforce development, recognizing that critical role high quality training and in-demand occupations can play in leading to good quality jobs and pathways to unionization. And a major component of that investment is strengthening the pipeline to these training opportunities. So more women, people of color, people impacted by the justice system, people with disabilities and other underserved communities can really take advantage of that. The American Families Plan makes critical investments in education, including 2 years of free community college. And, when we talk about critical work family supports, this past year has led to tremendous job loss and threatened economic security, eroding more than 30 years of progress in women's labor force participation and resulting in a $64 billion loss in wages and economic activity per year. And this has not just hurt the health and well-being of American families, but also of the overall US economy, and it's stalling our economic growth and competitiveness. So we see a lack of family-friendly policies, such as paid family medical leave and access to quality, affordable childcare as exacerbating those. And that's why, again, the president in the American Families Plan has proposed critical direct supports to families to ensure that low and middle income families spend no more than 7% of their income on childcare, and that the childcare they access is of high quality. It'll also provide direct support to workers and families by creating a national comprehensive paid family medical leave program that will hopefully bring us closer to other competitor nations that have paid family medical leave programs.
I'd like to just invite, with our last few minutes, other panelists to add to that about thoughts they have about policies or practices that might be needed to significantly improve job quality or incentivize employers to take a higher road to their labor strategy. So,
yeah, I'd love to jump in. We've talked about some employer strategies, and again, at the Good Jobs Institute, we work directly with employers. There's lots of ways to get to good jobs in a way that is sustainable. We've talked about government, and it's so exciting. There's so many great policy out there that hopefully will pass. Another group is investors. So ESG, environmental, social governance issues have really exploded in the last couple of years, but the S there, social, is really underdeveloped around job quality. I think this is a massive opportunity. So some people are talking about adding an E for employee to EESG, but this is huge, right? So the SEC mandates lots of disclosure from public companies, and they just changed the human capital disclosure. Prior to 2020, companies only had to disclose the number of employees, so nothing about job quality. And they've changed to say, if job quality is, if human capital metrics are material, you can report on them. But it's super loose, it's super vague. And of course, human capital metrics are material. I can't think of an industry where they're not. So really exciting work is happening in California with the California Controller and the Urban Institute. They've got a bill that would require companies with 1,000 or more employees in California to report on a fantastic set of human capital metrics and job quality metrics. And I think that's a great model for any state and for the nation. We need more transparency. And I think that kind of pressure from government and employers and investors, that kind of transparency will be super helpful.
One of the things I think is that we have to look at the fact that we have 12 million undocumented people in the country. They're doing low wage work, and they're bringing down the level of wages because they have no power whatsoever. They're afraid of being deported. So legalization of workers, including the essential workers, again, that Arnie talked about, there's 5 million people who are undocumented who are doing that essential work, so that they in fact could be covered by minimum wage. They could organize into a union. They would not be afraid of asking their employer for better conditions, would help us to bring up the floor. And by bringing up the floor, that can bring up other workers as well who are low wage workers. So another big picture issue that I think we really need to deal with as a country.
Let me just say that I just very briefly is that yes, good jobs are a good business, so employers should be doing that. I'm delighted that the Biden administration is doing what they're doing, but none of this is going to happen unless workers are able to exert their power over employers and their politicians. That is the real problem here, the lack of worker power, it seems to me.
Thank you for that. Thanks for all of your insights on this important topic about how we think about and define what it means to have a good job. This concludes this particular panel, and I now have the pleasure of introducing Lakeitha Furby, who's going to moderate our second panel. Lakeitha is the Executive Director of Strive New York, a workforce development organization that provides career development, skills training, and wraparound services to workers. She has extensive experience in workforce development and served as Assistant Deputy Commissioner of Employer Partnerships with New York City's Human Resources Administration. And in addition, she's held leadership roles in the nonprofit sector and currently serves on the board of directors of the New York City Employment and Training Coalition. So welcome, Lakeitha.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here with you today. As Molly mentioned, Strive is a workforce development agency. We're located in East Harlem. At Strive, we aim to promote pathways and help people get to good jobs. And we do this through occupational training, job coaching, career coaching, and job placement assistance, and other critical wraparound services. Today, I am joined by two Strive alumni, and one person who will be an alumni on Friday when she graduates her program. So I would like to introduce Jose Soltero, Tiffany Martin-Lobin, and Tanya and Dip. I think it's really important to hear their perspectives as we're talking about it. We heard other people say that it's so critical to understand how policies impact the workers' lives. And so I'm really excited to have this conversation with the three of you. My first question is for Jose. And Jose, can you talk about what a good job means to you?
Well, a good job to me means, well, obviously a decent pay, the ability to be able to raise in ranks or, advance in the ranks. But culture is a very big thing as well. Being able to feel safe in the workplace, being able to feel at ease, the camaraderie, in essence, at the workplace.
Thank you, Jose. Tiffany, I'm interested from your perspective. Can you share what a good job means to you and how your role as a parent has influenced how you think about job quality?
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. As a mom, I've noticed that I've had to reinvent myself with each child that I've had. I have 3 children, married with 3 children. And with each child, I had to reinvent myself, not feeling that I have the sovereignty to just be allowed to say that I am a mom and I have this responsibility on my hands. So a good job for me was a job that thought about me as a whole individual, as a person, and not strip away the title as mother and have to be making up stories to try and cover up what I have to do. So a job that thinks of me as an individual, a whole individual, is what is titled a good job to me.
Thank you so much. Tanya, turning to you, what characteristics do you think make a job a good job and why? Tanya, are we having?
I'm sorry, it went out.
Oh, there we go.
Can you repeat?
Sorry. So Tanya,
can you repeat that one more time? Hi.
No problem. Tanya, what characteristics make a job a good job to you and why?
Okay, thank you so much for asking me, and thank you everyone that's here. This is an amazing opportunity. From so far, I've heard so many things. Looks like you're all on point. So from the White House down. So I just want to add my little point. What make a good job for me would be, I wrote a note because coming from the background of working with different people, including in behavioral health, sometimes there's a lot of emotional stress. And I know that as a person who's always enjoyed taking care of customers, we do know that customers are always right. But what we don't always hear is that the employee is always safe from emotional and psychological trauma. And I think that I would want to be in a job that would protect me. I know that we have Department of Labor, we have labor laws, we have people of interest that can help you when you're in the workplace. But because of overtime and the amount that they give us all the time, sometimes we can't say no. You know, it affects our lives, our family, can make us nervous, uncomfortable. And I definitely would want to be in a safe environment. And I know that that's hard because during the pandemic, many of us were not safe. So we can just X out 2020 as far as understanding how to be safe in environment. We were all, you know, learning. But that's one of the things I like to say, just to start off with, you know, just making sure that we're psychologically safe. And that's just something that has not been the case for so many people for so long. You know, is reason why they're hint, trying to make sure that their unions involved, when every job should be so amazing that you don't need a union. You know, you just need people to be held accountable. And I think that's really important. And I think that you need staff that's trained on how to care. You know, a lot of times employees and supervisors are just rushing to get the job done to take care of the customer, but we get put in the back burner, unfortunately.
Thank you, Tanya. Turning to Tiffany, we heard Arnie talk about the importance of control over your schedule. And you have a background that's been in human service fields, call center, as you mentioned, reinventing yourself with each child.
Mm.
Can you talk about how lack of control of how you've experienced the lack of control over your schedule in the past and the effect that it's had on you?
Sure. All right. And when I had my second child, I was big on call center work. I love, because call centers, they had various schedules and it was a little bit more flexible. So I wanted to work in the best call center, the most vital call center. I'm sure you all know the number, but I'll just leave it at that. So I got the position and I was so excited to be a part of an elite unit that had purpose. But the thing is that upon getting into that role, I was immediately told that the fact that you have kids don't matter. You'll be ordered for overtime. You have to work 2 shifts sometimes. So my shift started at 7 p.m. Sometimes I wouldn't get home until 11 a.m. the next day. And this was a call center full of women who had children at home. And I can't just happen to find a babysitter on the fly or happen to tell my husband, stop going to work today because I have to work overtime. And this is a good job that has good benefits, you know, so I had to just adjust. And what happened is I ended up having to resign from that position. We had some family, you know, disputes at home because I was going to work at night. My husband was going to work at day. So we became 2 shifts passing in the night. It started to have a strain us emotionally. And then eventually I just couldn't take it anymore. Burnout kicked in. So this is how it affected me as a mom. And I even took on another role later on after I had my 3rd child as a parent coach, family support workers. And these are roles that are geared towards women and geared towards community building and resources. But there's small gaps because I participated in a lot of these programs that are offered to my community. I got to know how it feels to receive it. But when I was hired for these positions in my community, I saw the other side of it. And it made me understand how these nonprofit organizations can better help the community. So being able to see both sides was actually a blessing and a curse, because the people who couldn't see my side as a participant didn't want to change it because they were so used to the way it was all the time. So then I became the martyr. I became the person who was always complaining and pointing things out because I knew how it was to be a recipient and how to now be the person facilitating these same programs and things. So that's how it affects.
Thank you. So you're speaking to worker voice and people valuing your experience that you bring to the table.
Yes.
Thank you. I agree that we've heard that that's critical today. I'm wondering, Tanya, if you could talk about, just continuing on this, so Tiffany talked about having mandated overtime as how she's experienced a lack of control over her hours. Tanya, can you add to that? What's your experience been in terms of how have you experienced a lack of control over your hours?
Well, you know, I thought working in the health field, I may have to do a 12-hour shift one day, but I'm not a nurse and I'm not a doctor and I don't have any of those, you know, I didn't go to school for any of that. I'm an admin. I was amazed that you can actually work 16-hour shifts back to back. And if you don't take it when someone's on vacation, it seems like you may keep your job or you may not. You know how someone gives you the eye or they follow up and ask you why you can't. So I was in an environment, and I know that other people have. I'm not the only one. I'm nowhere near original. You know, I've been in the workforce since 1984. Hint, hint, you know, I'm not a spring chicken. I'm a chicken in the spring. So I will say that I have been in an environment where you've had to work a lot of hours to protect your protect your job, protect your shifts. And it's unfortunate because that played a role on me, and I gained a lot of weight. I ended up having to retire from the job, and I decided to pursue other means and be a full-time at what I do as a photographer. But I had gained so much weight that they thought I was really sick. I was getting swollen legs and everything. So when I let go of that job and said goodbye, I gave them 2 months notice. I lost weight, 50 pounds, and I became a changed person because of lacking in the stress, right? Not having to deal with that. But that's really hard. When you work hard, you care about your job, you care about the people, you want to do what's right. But when they don't come in and intervene and help you out and give you a temp, which is a whole nother story. I love temps. I'm a professional temp whenever I need a job. But working for someone that really makes you work a lot of hours and doesn't care that you're falling apart, that's scary. And it happens to many of us. And I'm so sorry that we're in a country that we kind of sometimes make other countries look really bad, as far as work ethics and things. But we've really, really, really got to fix this situation. I'm so glad for the people that are discussing it now. I heard a lot from Ms. Gupta and a few other people. And, I definitely I'm glad I'm here.
Thank you. Turning to you, Jose, can you talk a little bit about what things about a job are most likely to help workers advance economically, to be able to earn more, save more, and move up in their careers?
Well, training would definitely be first and foremost among them. You'll see many times that there's a requirement for degrees or what have you. But a lot of times what's excluded is the experience that an individual has. Some individuals have obtained a degree, such as myself. However, you have other individuals who are very well experienced, have had a lot of different types of skills, such as Tanya, and that's not really recognized. As you'll see that jobs are posted, they'll refer to things such as preferred or required certain skills, not recognizing the experiences that certain individuals have in different fields. And I think that's something that's very important. It's something that needs to be addressed, because there are sites that will state preferred or required and automatically exclude individuals who have better skill sets, but unfortunately don't have either the certification or a degree. So I think that's one of the biggest things that needs to be addressed. There has to be the training that's recognized within the businesses that can be transferred over into another job.
Thank you. Tiffany, I'd love your perspective on this question as well. What do you think could be done to help more people advance in the workplace?
Thank you for asking for my perspective. I think a lot of times when you have employers, they've been working for a long time, so they don't remember what it is to go without. Sometimes they get comfortable. It might seem it's a little bit oblivious sometimes, because if I'm hungry and I haven't eaten for weeks and I just got this job, you're not considering, hey, this employee came in, she didn't eat, she hasn't been working for a month, and she has 3 children at home and a husband who's working triple overtime trying to keep ends meet. Does this employer really consider me a whole individual coming into their organization? I'm already coming into your organization with stress that is not produced by you, but it's something that you're going to have to deal with in the long run. And it's also going to have a dramatic effect on your business and how I'm going to do the job that you hired me for. So a lot of things have to go into consideration, and especially with this new workforce that's coming back into an old system. A lot of people have been home quarantined for a long time. We don't want to go back to the way it was. We need to find a different way, and we need to do it now. because it's going to be detrimental lawsuits, a lot of different things, heavy rotation. I'm just throwing things out there that I've seen happen. Thank you for asking.
No problem. Tanya, can you talk a little bit about the ways in which you've seen employers value education more over experience and how that creates barriers? How you've seen that happen?
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's interesting you asked me, and thank you, because I have a GED and I'm a Strive alumni. I was able to come to Strive and do really well. I had other jobs, but I never went to college until I tried to go to college when I got that career job, but the hours were so long I had to quit college because I had to work those long shifts. And I was failing in my classes because I was too tired. But what I did find out is that you don't have to be a brilliant grad student to get a good job. And I think also from working for Temps and being a HR sourcer in the past, my employers would often ask me to find people that had a degree. And then they go on an interview and they stutter and they talk, they don't come on time, they're not organized. And here people like me have been in the workforce for a long time. And I'm really, really, I'm so thankful that Jose kind of hinted that, we don't get chosen well, because they were looking for something that, I don't know if it's a fairy tale, but it's the same way that the people that started Customers is Always Right, which came from 3 guys that were really good in retail a long time ago that, got stuck, but we know customers aren't always right. We just have to take care of them. But I will tell you that if you really look at how many people that don't have degrees that have been working and taking care of their family and investing for their family for a long time, those are the people you need to be looking at. It's great. You want to give a college grad a good job and help them so they can start paying back that debt. I understand, but I don't know what they're looking for in that field, because sometimes they need training, and here we are, a lot of trained people, and we get caught out there and put in the back burner again. It's just very unfortunate. I'm sure you guys have communicated and said that before, but I'm glad. I've had many jobs without having a degree, so I can't complain too much. I've had some really excellent jobs. Maybe it's the way I communicate. Maybe it's me being on time. Maybe it's me putting my best foot forward, but that comes from upbringing and also Strive. I have to honestly say that.
Oh, thank you. You didn't even pay her to say that, but thank you. Jose, do you think there should be a minimum level of job quality, like the minimum wage? And if so, what would it be? What would you include?
Yeah, I think there should be a minimum job qualities. Some of the things that are requested or subtly requested are something, the soft skills that people tend to overlook, something that obviously Tanya as well as Tiffany have, the ability to communicate effectively with somebody. These little things, these nuances, they're readily overlooked. They're already supposed to be a part of any job that one takes on. I think I got to go back to training, that actual training that's it's transferable. I think these are like the little subtle nuances. See, because what may be overlooked, or in fact, I believe is overlooked frequently, is the degree purportedly states that this person is qualified to do whatever, but there are a variety of multiple marketable skill sets. And these skill sets are not readily acknowledged. These are the subtle things that come with the varying jobs that one has had. So some standard, I guess, to be able to acknowledge or be able to evaluate this for individuals who may not have the degrees and may not have the certifications, but can still be able to do the job likely better than someone who may have a degree, as was referenced earlier. You got kids that are just coming out of college and they'll stutter, they'll do whatever the case may be. They're not readily equipped to be able to accomplish or fulfill the job. So yes, I think it would have to, a format, a standard would be formulated to be able to determine the person's life experiences and determining these different skill sets that make them an ideal candidate.
Thank you, Jose. Tiffany, what would you add to a minimum job quality standard for everyone?
I would love if that requirement was started in high school, because if high school is the minimum requirement, you have to graduate high school. It's a law, everyone has to graduate high school. That should be added So when you graduate high school, you have a certain amount of training, a certain amount of skill set that you know what you're getting yourself into. So you won't be, left out in the winds. So you know how to gauge yourself to get jobs. There's a lot of things that I had to pick up on my own or research on my own that I should have learned in high school, to set me up for a better position in life. So, and I went to Catholic school, and a lot of my counterparts went to public school. A lot of this whole system of education has to be reevaluated. If we're going to add this barrier for workforce, it has to be done for education and schooling as well.
Thank you. So you're saying really bring more of the practical application of skills into high schools, into our standard education.
Absolutely.
Would make a huge difference.
Similar to what Strive is doing. So another plug for Strive again. Yes.
Tanya, I'm going to flip the question a little bit. Do you think public campaigns like Good Jobs movement will help improve job quality and reduce differences between good jobs and not so good jobs? I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
I don't know. I hope so. I just wanted to say that I like that we have Good Jobs Institute. I never heard of that before, so that was powerful. And I think I've worked along with Urban Institute years ago on some social science issues. So I know that they've been fighting a long race. We have a lot of things that are out there that are geared to educate and be a voice. Any of us can be a voice. Our children are becoming voices. We don't have to campaign too big. Now they can just go out there and speak. You put them on Facebook and it's the story. You put them on YouTube and they'll tell you the truth. They'll tell you, please hire my mom. She's a good mom and she works hard. It can be that simple. But what I will say is that this is hopefully, with the pandemic behind us a little bit, hopefully it's almost given us birth to more organization, more unity, more relationships. I think people are treasuring life better. So with that, I'm sure a lot of people's lives are transitioned and they want to do better. So yeah, I would say yes. I think it's good.
Thank you. Jose, what about you? How do you feel about a Good Jobs campaign? Do you think it'll make a difference for all workers?
I think it can. I think anytime that an issue is brought to light, is disseminated among the masses, I think that's one of the best things that could be done, because there's been campaigns, we're talking about all different types of campaigns going over years and years. So I think at this particular point in time, especially with social media, virtually anything can be done. But if people don't know, then how can they even address a particular issue? So yes, I think a public campaign would definitely be something that's very important to be able to bring this issue to the forefront.
Thank you. Lastly, I would just ask, as we heard Arnie and other panelists talk a little bit earlier about wages and training and job autonomy. Is there anything you think that you would want to add to people as we think about good jobs and how you think about good jobs? I'm just going to open it up to all three of you to just share any last thoughts.
Can I add? I already have it. I don't want to lose it.
Go for it. Go for it.
So excited to be here and say, if I could reiterate the importance of accountability to any staff on any job, and that's from the top up. There should be an outside accountability team that can go in and help the CEO of a company, and train him, not train his staff to do well, but train him to oversee the people that are under him and not exasperate the supervisors. Some supervisors are phenomenal, but they get burnt out. So I think accountability is important. I think the Department of Labor needs to change. And I think it would be really great if they had an accountability team from the White House, so that's hint, hint. They can just help them. I'm just saying we have amazing people here, so might as well put it out there. Thank you, White House, but really, and I think there needs to be accountability to the worker to constantly refresh, reboot, and come into a job with a training and go back and forth. And you know how some jobs once a year, they make you do some program. Mm-hmm. I just think every other month, there should be a 20-minute recap with employees, what they've learned, what they like and what's hard for them. And the accountability team view that, and then they walk away with that and they help them. You can get college grads that are just need to do an internship. They could be on an accountability team because
Can you
they're
tell
fresh.
me more about what you mean about accountability? So I'm hearing you say, what I think I heard you say is like more training. You want more training, and then there just should be someone making sure that training happens, much like we have to do a mandatory sexual harassment annually. Like, so when you say accountability, it sounds like you're talking about making sure that supervisor training happens, because it's sounding like you're saying it, you haven't seen that, and the supervisors are getting burnt out. Is that accurate?
Right. Well, I just mean an outside source that's mandated for companies that have a certain large amount of employees to have an outsourced accountability team instead of outsourcing for job readiness and helping them to gear them how to teach and educate. There need to be an accountability team. You can't have everything else and then not know how to run your company. Everyone needs help. So that's what I was talking about. I don't know how that's going to be. Just something I just.
But you're saying accountability to ensure that staff training, et cetera, happens. Thank you, Tiffany. Jose, what would you add in our 5 remaining minutes here? What would you add in terms of anything else that you heard from Good Jobs and that you want people to take away from your perspective?
I think I want to reiterate a little bit of what Tanya was making reference to. Accountability is very important, and there should be some type of method by which companies can be evaluated. One of the panelists previously spoke about ESG. Well, the social component appears in the stock listings, the stock quotes on companies where they're stating that we do X, Y, and Z to be able to accomplish our ESG. Well, that's social component. Well, what are you doing for the employees in the company? Can they be set as a standard for other companies? Because it's readily a report card. When investors are looking certain things, they'll be like, okay, well, we're looking at the particular requirements. What are they fulfilling? And they're rated. So if that social component can be augmented by demonstrating that this is what we're doing for our employees, this is how we're allowing for certain things for our employees, this is the standards that we're applying, then perhaps that can be transferred over to other companies, and it will build so that individuals, even if they don't have the certifications or the degrees, they're still being allowed to rise among the rungs to be able to get where many people want to get to, which is a better paying job or a better status in life.
So it sounded like we collectively are saying there needs to be a place to ensure that people just have continued opportunity to grow, because right now it feels like as workers, there's not really a place for you to turn to if you feel like you've been cut off from opportunity, or just making sure that opportunity happens. Is that just leading into that piece now? Tiffany, is there anything you would add here? Our remaining 2 minutes.
I would just go with my fellow panelists and say accountability, because a lot of times in the hiccups that I've had, if there was some form of accountability for both the employer and even the employee, there will be everyone will know where they stand. There will be a lack of obliviousness or guesswork or gray area. We'll all know where we all stand. And that's what is most important. We all need to know where we stand instead of this gray guessing type of thing and smudging and blurring the lines. So
I got you, because we're not in unions.
Yes.
Union structures, there's real clear method of who I go to, what happens if something is unfair, versus in the wider, it's not. So echoing what some of our panelists earlier said about the importance of workers having the ability to come together, wanting a sense of accountability. So you feel like you have a voice there as well.
Accountability and sovereignty, where you feel like, okay, I do have some say in what I'm doing with my life. I choose to be employed with this organization, but there is a sense of sovereignty where I don't feel pressured and overwhelmed by the policies and procedures of the organization.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all 3 of you. It's been so valuable for me to connect the dots between what we see research is saying about control over schedule and how that has experienced and impacted your life. I'm really struck by the fact that both Tiffany and Tanya reported going to the emergency room because stress got so bad. Like we heard Arnie say stress, it can result in stress, but I think it just resonates so much more powerfully when you hear, where you say, like, I didn't have this control, I was trying to make it work, I ended up in the emergency rooms. So I want to thank you so much for sharing your perspective and just really adding a richness to our conversation about good jobs and the impact it could make on people's lives and family. So thank you, Jose and Tanya, and I appreciate you, and just so delighted that you're here to share it with us. So now I would like to turn it over to Elizabeth Jacobs, who are going to moderate the final panel. Elizabeth is a senior fellow at the Urban Institute and deputy director of WorkRise. Elizabeth has served in leadership roles at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth and policy advisory roles with the U.S. Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, Pensions, and the U.S. Joint Economic Committee. She is a nationally recognized expert on family income, earning stability, low-wage employment, and job quality. Elizabeth, turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Lakeitha. We have heard throughout this forum that job quality can be defined differently, but common themes have emerged: pay and benefits, a healthy and safe workplace. I would add to that dignity and respect, as well as opportunities to advance one's career. And the question now is, where do we go from here? What role does research, philanthropy, and employers play in making quality jobs a reality for more workers? And I am just delighted to welcome and introduce our distinguished panel to help us answer those questions. So Anmal Chadha is a principal with the Reimagining Capital team at the Omidyar Network, where he focuses on increasing the power of working people. Anmal has extensive experience in policy and social science research on topics such as economic and racial inequality, low-wage work, job quality, debt, and wealth. He previously led the Equitable Futures Lab at the Institute for the Future, where he managed the California Future of Work Commission, created by Governor Gavin Newsom to develop a broad agenda to promote economic equity in the state. Welcome, Anmal. Alex Hertel-Fernandez is Deputy Assistant Secretary for Research and Evaluation at the United States Department of Labor. He's currently on academic leave from his position as an Associate Professor of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, where he also co-directs the Columbia Labor Lab, an academic center for implementing rigorous data-driven evaluations in partnership with worker organizations. His most recent research has focused on working conditions during the COVID-19 crisis, as well as workers' access to unemployment benefits and workers' knowledge of their rights, as well as access to workplace information. Welcome, Alex. Lastly, I'd like to welcome Michelle Wilson, who is the Director of Evaluation and Learning at the National Fund for Workforce Solutions, a national network of communities taking a demand-driven, evidence-based approach to workforce development. The fund collaborates with workers, employers, and communities to advance a skilled workforce, promote good jobs, and invest in equitable outcomes. Michelle has spent nearly 2 decades conducting and leading community-level research, program development, and evaluation, design, and implementation. Welcome, Michelle. So I'm going to start us off with questions, but I want to encourage you all to talk to each other as well as to me, and encourage our audience to put their questions in the chat, because we'll have some time at the end for audience Q&A. So I'm going to start with a question for you, Michelle. I'm wondering, what are the possibilities for a movement around good jobs, as opposed to separate campaigns or efforts for the different specific elements of a job? For example, minimum wage, paid leave. Do we want a big picture campaign, or do we want to have it kind of targeted to these specific different elements in terms of an organizing and research strategy?
Great, thanks, Elizabeth. So let me start by saying that it's a both and for me, right? The Good Jobs campaign must happen on multiple fronts, and that requires that we drill down on those specific job elements like wage, like paid leave, et cetera. And with regards to the possibilities for movement, absolutely. As long as we're clear about what job quality looks like and for whom, right? And that we're not marching towards some monolithic response, because that can create a breeding ground for inequities. At the National Fund, one of our solutions is on changing systems. And we do this because by changing systems, you create space for scale. And I would offer as an example some of the work that we're doing in our advancing workforce equity. You know, we've worked with several communities in our network, and each went through the same process but it was contextualized for their community. And so the movement is around workforce equity, but that looks different based on the challenges with regard to those communities. And then I would go a step further in saying that to really understand those issues requires a deep dive into disaggregated data in a way that tells a full tale of what a community is experiencing in order to create those equitable solutions. And these are some of the things I'm echoing what's already been stated earlier, but that's how I think about it.
I want to give the rest of you a chance to respond to that as well, as I know it's something that I'm sure you all have thought about. Benefits or pros and cons strategy around an overarching good jobs campaign versus narrower specific campaigns or efforts. And I guess I'll piggyback on that also by asking any or all of you to think about, if you had to prioritize, even in the context of an overarching campaign, how do you think about what comes first?
I can jump in and I'll pass it to Alex after this. I think, I agree wholeheartedly with what Michelle said, that this really is a both and I think, we, rather than getting lost in sort of the mechanics of specific campaigns and which specific aspects to prioritize, I think those are very context specific, depending on the region or the state or the industry or the sector. But I do think there is a need, and we're seeing this, I think we are actually seeing the emergence of this movement for good jobs and for greater job quality. And I think that we started to see that actually before the pandemic. I think there was some recognition that there was, and this goes to some of our work in California as well as the rest of the country, that we were really facing a crisis in job quality, that the traditional measures of jobs, just the quantity of jobs and the unemployment rate and things like that weren't sufficient. And this goes back, we know for several decades now, there was a growing movement around local minimum wage and state minimum wage ordinances. The living wage movement, of course, pushed this up to, this greater fight for what workers really deserve in order to survive in our economy, in our society. And I think then there's greater recognition that wages weren't enough, right? That we needed these different aspects of job quality to come up as well. And I think the pandemic in many ways may have created some opportunities for greater recognition for especially essential workers who are often very low paid and working in service sector jobs. And I think what we've seen, especially from Pranita Gupta's comments earlier today, right, is that we have an administration in place that really is speaking this language of job quality. And it's not just about wages, it is about these different dimensions of job quality. So I think that we are there's an opening here for a bigger movement now for job quality. And I think that's exciting. We have people on the ground. We have people like ourselves in this conversation today. We have institutions like Urban Institute, Brookings, and others who are part of this conversation. And I think we have our important allies and players in the administration as well, like Alex.
Sure. So thanks so much for the opportunity to participate in this panel and to the broader event. I've already been soaking up so much from the fantastic discussion to take back to the Department of Labor. So I'd like to think a little bit about the role of the federal government, the Department of Labor in particular, in producing the kind of evidence base and knowledge that we need to sustain exactly the sort of movements that Anmol and Michelle were talking about. And in particular, I think we've heard repeatedly today about the importance of broadening our definition of job quality. And that's borne out in the individual experiences of the Strive participants that we heard on the previous panel so powerfully. It's also borne out by large-scale data collection that I know folks in this room have been contributing to. For instance, the Gallup Great Jobs Demonstration Survey that indicated that workers themselves think about a whole range of other attributes as being critically important to how they categorize a good job. Things like job security, certainly worker power, scheduling stability, and opportunities for advancement. Yet despite the fact that workers have this nuanced appreciation for these different characteristics of our jobs, I think all too frequently, many of the statistics that we collect and report on do not encompass that broader set of job characteristics. And while the statistics we do gather provide an incredibly rich, detailed, and important picture of the economy, it's not the whole picture, and it's not encompassing of everything that workers themselves think is important. So I think we're at a really important moment where we can think about what we can learn from our partners in labor market organizations, our partners in research organizations and policy organizations like Urban, in order to expand the sort of job conditions that we measure and report on regularly. And I guess I would point to two areas that have really resonated with me over the course of the conversation so far. One is scheduling. We heard so vividly in the previous panel from Tanya and Tiffany about the toll that irregular and unpredictable scheduling can take on individual workers. We know that there is a growing body of research that indicates that as well. And yet, all too frequently, our standard statistics of job quality and measurement that we put out on a regular basis don't include these characteristics. So I'd be excited to think about opportunities for building on that. The other aspect that I think we lack fine-grained statistical indicators for that get reported on a more regular basis have to do with worker power and voice. I think the most relevant statistic that the federal government generates is, of course, the union membership and coverage rate, which is an important institutional measure of worker power and voice through formal organizations. But I think we can do better than that potentially by thinking about opportunities for workers to have input and control over different dimensions of their work life, and being able to say something about that on a much more disaggregated basis, I think would be quite powerful. I'll end by saying that I think that we have some great models for what this collaboration could look like. I think about the contingent worker supplement to the current population survey, for instance. I think that's a great example of how external organizations, external researchers, labor market partners came together and thought about the ways that we think of these concepts related to contingent work, alternative work arrangements, and its advice and recommendations that we're certainly thinking through at the Department of Labor as we've revised those supplements to our federal statistical series. So excited to think about that as a model for further measurement and reporting on all of the characteristics that we've talked about today.
So I'm going to tie together a few things that I heard, and then I want to give you the opportunity, Alex, to say a little bit more about the contingent worker survey and the story behind that, just for folks in our audience who might not know. On the one hand, it's kind of a wonky story of collaboration across sectors. On the other hand, I think it's exactly the kind of thing that's a useful example of how data sources can come to be and might be an illustrative case. So I think just to kind of tie together the thinking about the federal government's role in terms of job quality measures and what it does and doesn't do and might do, and thinking about a good jobs campaign versus these smaller pieces, I would just observe that I think in some ways, if there's a good jobs campaign and the goal is to actually create more economically secure, stable, and promotion of opportunity type jobs, right, for workers, there's a variety of different elements that are on the table that would be part of that strategy in order to achieve that goal. And the tie to Alex to what you're talking about in terms of specific metrics is thinking about how do we track the different pieces of that big strategy and figure out which ones matter and for whom. And that for whom question is a really important one because, as I think you all have mentioned at some point, how the labor market works and for whom is really different across geographies, across different racial backgrounds, across education backgrounds. So we have lots of work to do, but in putting the kind of data collection in the context of the campaign-ish question, I think there's really a direct link in terms of thinking about how we might think about a forward path. So Alex, I want to give you another minute just to explain to folks what the contingent worker survey is and how it came about, and then I'm gonna circle back with another question for everyone.
Sure. And there are folks I know at this committee who played a very central role in thinking through both the strengths and the ways that that supplement historically can be revised as we look to it going forward. But in brief, it is an important supplement to one of our workhorse labor force surveys that gauges the number of workers who are engaged in what we might think of as short-term, temporary, alternative work arrangements that don't correspond to full-time formal work arrangements. And that is of great interest and of growing interest, I think, to the policymaking community, to the employer community, to researchers, given all of the increasing attention that's been paid to these sort of arrangements, including in the so-called gig economy, but also elsewhere. And there have been a number of surveys that have pointed to different levels of participation in these kind of alternative work arrangements. But the value of the current population survey is that it's really a gold standard methodology that's been well validated. And so it presents an important opportunity to get these benchmarks that are comparable over time. And yet there have been important questions raised about the methodology, the sort of survey items that are used to tap into those items. And we've benefited from the input of external researchers, of labor market partners, culminating in a National Academies report that produced a series of recommendations for how to revise that supplement. And I think that's a great example of how we can play to the differential strengths, comparative advantages of these different actors, whether it's the high quality statistical production of the federal government, whether it's the ability of external researchers to test new concepts quickly using other survey platforms, or whether it's the convening authority of places like Urban or other policy organizations to facilitate this conversation.
Thank you. I think it's also a really interesting example of the federal government figuring out how to catch up with what was happening in the labor market in ways that weren't being measured. So the contingent worker survey is in some ways the best source we have on how prevalent platform gig work is. It can do other things, but it also captures that in ways that standard data sources just weren't. And yet we were seeing news story after news story after news story about the role that this kind of evolution in the labor market was playing. And so I would also note that, you know, sometimes we think of federal data as like a slow moving, you know, dinosaur, but it's actually in this case managed to do some catch up in a way that's been really influential for our understanding of what's happening on the ground. So moving away from wonkery, which I love, but I want to go back to thinking about partnerships and collaboration, because just noting across this entire event, we I think have seen in a variety of ways the roles, not just for research and data, obviously, but that employers play a role, workers play a role, workforce practitioners, for example, Strive, and the voices of workers, including the incredible folks that we just heard from, figuring out how to collaborate and use those collaborations across sectors to create good jobs. And I would add to that to measure what's working and for whom feels like a critical path forward. And I want to start with Anmol, because I know you just spent many hours, days, weeks, months, blood, sweat, and tears on the Future of Work Commission at California, which I think was a really great example of doing this kind of thing. So I will turn it over to you to tell us a little bit about your thoughts based on that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So in California, we did, as you mentioned, the Future of Work Commission, which started a couple of years ago. And it was really an effort. It brought together employers, labor groups, and worker representatives, the tech sector, venture capitalists, higher ed system, and policymakers. So working really across sectors to think about these questions around the future of work, specifically in California, although I think a lot of our work extended, you know, is very relevant and extends to other states as well. I would say, you know, if you think back a few years ago, there's a lot of energy and interest in the future of work, and it's specifically framed around technological change and automation and job loss through automation. And through the Future of Work Commission in California, we really try to reframe a lot of that discussion, so moving away from the questions around the threat of a robot apocalypse that was going to take away all the jobs, and so really thinking about job quality and economic equity in California. You know, so rather than starting with the question of what kinds of jobs, what will we be doing for work in the future, and what kinds of jobs will we be doing in the future, the question was really that, you know, that in many ways jobs and work has failed so many people working in California. So what is it that we want jobs and work to be doing for us in the future? How have they failed so far to sort of reach what we ultimately ended with the new social compact? But how have jobs and work for decades really failed to provide a basic economic livelihood for so many people that are working in really what is, you know, a state that has an economy that's probably the envy of so many states, and extraordinary engines of wealth generation and creation from the tech industry and other industries, really successful industries in the state by all traditional measures. And then we started the work before COVID on the commission. Before COVID, we were looking at 120 consecutive months of job growth, really low unemployment. And so it was really the height of economic success. This is what our economic model should be producing. But what that actually looked like on the ground was more than a third of workers in California were making less than $15 an hour. In that Gallup study that Alex had mentioned earlier, about 40% of all workers, only 40%, sorry, were in good jobs. And this is even before COVID. So at really the height of economic success in a state that was excelling on all, you know, the general economic indicators, what it looks like is that the majority of people aren't working or don't have quality jobs. Right. So, and that's really what the best case scenario looked like. So that was what other states were almost trying to emulate, right? That they wanted to pursue the similar model that California had and those economic successes. But we saw firsthand, I think, a lot of the failures of that economic model. And so I mentioned earlier this sense of a job quality crisis, and we were seeing it firsthand in California that our current economic model wasn't fixing this, right? And I think what we ended up converging on in the Future of Work Commission was this real pressing need to develop a new social compact that was going to draw on all stakeholders across all sectors, that there'd be a role for all stakeholders. You know, I think there's obvious stuff for government policy and for employers as well, but even things like venture capitalists and investors, that there is an opportunity to actually attach job quality standards to investments, right, in a way that hasn't really been done up till now. So that can, that's maybe one approach to prevent these different models of what's considered innovation that are really, in many ways a race to the bottom for work conditions and job quality, and that are, repurposing work that for industries or work that we're familiar with, and creating piecemeal work and gig work and work that's not providing a good standard of living for the people that are doing those jobs. But so there's a role for all the stakeholders. It's not just, I think we do need to lean heavily on employers on the demand side of the labor market. As I mentioned, there's a role for investors. There's a role, I think there's obviously a continuing role for government policy as well to ensure that we have these things, happening on the demand side. So it's not just left up to workers to upskill or train themselves to get better jobs. We need to be producing better jobs in the economy for workers to attain.
Fabulous. So this is a really nice segue to a question for Michelle, because one of the things I know that the National Fund does amazing work on is engaging employers around issues of job quality. And so I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about what role you think employers play, what you've seen on the ground, and what's worked for you in terms of engaging employers around these issues.
Yeah, so for us at the National Fund, I mean, obviously we believe that employers are responsible for the job design, and our job quality framework lays out nicely the 4 pillars in job design, which are the core elements. And you guys are doing work on this as well too. Core elements: support, opportunity, and worker voice. And for us, creating that framework, but again, not creating this one size fits all model, but identifying elements in each one of those areas and allowing employers to really choose what works for them. Or again, like context is everything. So being able to contextualize the work. And I think the work that we're doing around understanding employer motivation is really important as well too, because it allows us, it creates a jumping off point to identify interventions that work, right? But I also just want to mention here, one of the things that we spend a lot of time on is focusing on small and medium-sized businesses, which is, I know at one point we were talking about gaps in the work, but there's not a lot of research on small and medium-sized businesses, but that's one of the areas that we are really digging into and understand. That's a part of understanding employer motivation. So these are all elements of work that we're doing at the National Fund currently around job quality, among other things, but those are some of the key pieces.
Super helpful. So another piece, we've heard a bunch about this actually throughout in a lot of different ways, but I want to give you all the opportunity to dig in on it, is the relationship between worker voice, power, and representation in job quality. And that conversation often starts with unions. And Alex, as you mentioned, the way that the US government has historically measured this, kind of the one thing that we can hold out as a federal statistic is union density. But I think it was really interesting in listening to the folks on the last panel talk about what voice meant. In many ways, I mean, some of that would show up in union coverage, and a lot of it might not. So I would love to just toss out to you, and maybe we can start with Anmol, but I'd really like to hear from all of you on this. What role do unions or other forms of collective worker bargaining play? And not just worker bargaining, but also this sort of channels for worker voice, autonomy, respect at work. I think there's a big bundle of things there that maybe we can pull apart a little bit, but I don't want to lose sight of the autonomy and respect piece in addition to the collective bargaining and power piece, because they're related, but I think they're actually quite different. And what I was hearing on the last panel is that they matter in some ways equally at different times for different people in terms of defining what a quality job is. It's going to allow people to really show up at work, do their best work, and stick around. So I'll let Anmol take that first, and then I'll let you all jump in.
Sure. I think that's a great question. I think just establishing the basic fact that, the historical decline in unionization, union density, and worker power lines up perfectly with this deterioration in job quality. So those two things, I think we're pretty confident are pretty causally related there, and it's not just a coincidence or an accident. I think in terms of, actual collective bargaining and negotiating over working conditions, I think that, in many ways, that's the greatest form of respect that employers can show to workers, right? To be able to have that voice in their working conditions, that direct voice. And I think to the extent that workers exercise power over their working conditions, and we're able to bargain and hear and have those voices heard, I think that's where they would probably feel the greatest respect. I think the last thing I'll say is I think we've, I think the historical example of manufacturing jobs can be really instructive here. What we're talking about today in this conversation is this, as I mentioned, this crisis in job quality or this proliferation of bad jobs. And when we look at manufacturing jobs, what we've learned, manufacturing jobs in many ways are held up as the gold standard of what a good job is, right? And if you look historically, manufacturing jobs in the earliest times were really terrible jobs, right? They paid very low wages, they had really terrible working conditions, didn't even have basic protections for child workers. But we made those bad jobs into good jobs. And those bad jobs became good jobs largely through two means: through collective action by workers who organized to increase their power in the workplace, and through government policy changes, right? And so to the point where we took one of the worst jobs in the economy and made it the gold standard for what a good job is. And I think one of the lessons there is that, there's nothing inherent in the manufacturing work. There's nothing inherent in making things, making durable goods that meant that those had to be bad jobs. We made them into good jobs. And similarly, today we're looking at a different kind of labor market, or different composition of jobs, a lot of service sector jobs, care work, things like that. There's nothing inherent about care work. There's nothing inherent about domestic work, for example, that means that those have to be low-paying bad jobs. Just like we made the bad jobs of the past into good jobs, we can make today's bad jobs into good jobs as well. And like I said, we did that through increasing worker power, through collective action, and that was then reflected in the government policy changes that showed what we were willing to accept in terms of job quality. And so just like we've done that before, I think we have a moment where we can do something like that again.
So for me, I'll hop in and I'll say, I appreciate the conversations around unions and collective worker bargaining organizations, but my mind always goes back to, in the absence of those entities, what options are available, right? And how does this work get done? But I would also say, in the unions and the collective worker bargaining options, I would ask the question about who's it working on, who's not being served, right? Because there are some deep inequities in those spaces as well too. So I'd really like for us to, again, with the both and, dig in and uplift unions and collective bargaining organizations, collective worker bargaining organizations, but really put some attention towards those spaces in those communities or in the geographies in our country where that's not a current option. Like what's the solution for that?
And I would just echo Anmal's description of why worker power is so central as a characteristic of job quality. It is both something that workers value in its own right, but also the means through which you secure everything else. And I think the COVID-19 crisis illustrated that so clearly. During the height of the pandemic, we saw that workers who had those institutionalized means for participating in workplace governance through unions, through collective bargaining structures, they were substantially less likely to have been laid off, more likely to have access to paid time off if they needed it to take care of a sick family member or themselves, and more likely to have access to the protective equipment in COVID-19 testing that limit the spread of the virus. More generally, if we're thinking about defining job quality in the ways that workers themselves value, I think worker voice is just one of those areas that stands out as having one of the largest gaps between what workers say they want and what they're getting. And that's reflected in the Gallup data that we've been citing, as well as other research. I think the most recent survey evidence suggests that slightly less than a half of all non-unionized workers say they would join a union if one were available at their job. And of course, we can contrast that to the 11% union membership rate, for instance, as being a reflection of that gap.
So I'm going to turn to a question that I think picks up on some of the things that you all have been talking about, which is how we should be thinking about connecting efforts towards improving job quality to connecting efforts around combating discrimination, including occupational segregation, structural racism, and labor markets. And I'll piggyback on that with a really good question from the audience that ties it nicely to what you all were just talking about, which is a specific question on how we have to think about the future of union structures and the way that unions may impact racial and gender equity. So I'll let any of you jump in. I imagine all of you have things to say.
Well, Amal and Alex are on mute, and I'm not So I'll hop in first. So I'm going to say, so the simple answer is that there's no such thing as job quality in the face of oppression, like full stop, right? So I would say that any effort to improve the quality of job quality requires a critical examination and transformation of those inequitable practices that prevents access to anyone, particularly Black and Brown folks, from accessing quality jobs. So, I mean, that's my short answer because I know we're on time. So I will toss it to Amal and Alexander.
Recognizing that we're short on time, I'll just share that at the Department of Labor, we are implementing the whole of government executive order that came down on the first day of this new administration to advance equity for underserved communities. And this has been something that we've really taken seriously top to bottom across our agency and thinking about how we can leverage our programs, our protections, our procurement opportunities, all of the levers that we have at our disposal in order to reduce the gaps that we see in job quality and in standards between workers, and particularly for workers of color, for women, for those workers that have been historically excluded from the labor market. Whether that's through expanding who can participate in apprenticeship programs, the reach of our labor market protections, or our role as an employer and a contractor.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly say, I mean, I think this point's been made many times before, but I think, in sort of just general and broad macro terms, the movements for economic and racial justice have they've been connected for a very long time, right? And they never were sort of operating in isolation from each other. And the story about the March on Washington being, has actually been called about, the March for Freedom and Jobs. And this is the question of jobs and job quality has always been very closely linked to struggle around racial justice in our country. And I think that continues today. And I think to some extent we do a disservice to those movements when we focus just on very narrow questions of, whether we're just looking at raising wages, whether we have just narrow measures on unemployment and employment, how we can look at things for, just by different communities. And I think those are all important things that we need to be doing. But I think there are these ties between those broader movements that we especially, I'm in a little bit of a different position in philanthropy now, that I think that we can be really forging those connections even more so than they have been up to this point, so that they don't operate in isolation or in silos, so that, as Michelle mentioned, that those collective struggles can continue to be fought together, and we can see progress on both fronts.
Great. So Alex, you hinted at this in talking about the racial equity executive order, which I think is a good example of how the federal government's priorities, the administration's priorities, can infuse everything that the federal government does and really shape the context. But I want to give you some space to say a little bit more about what you think the role of the federal government is in defining standards for what counts as a quality job. We've talked some about federal labor standards and enforcement. You've mentioned a couple times the idea of the federal government as an employer and as a contractor and purchaser of goods and services. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. And then if time allows, I'd love Amal or Michelle, if you want to jump in and say a little bit about what you think the role of both the federal government, but I would add state and locals are. So I think one of the themes that is coming out of all of this is that there are a lot of sectoral partners necessary to actually really transform the labor market in the ways that I think we all agree we need to. And so to give you all some space to weigh in on what you think the government's role in that as well. But Alex, I'll let you answer first.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So I would say that I think there are at least 4 ways that we're thinking about this at the Department of Labor, taking advantage of these different roles that we play in the economy. And one we've already talked about, which is around data and measurement. What gets reported? What do we talk about? How do we think about providing resources so that researchers, labor market partners can think about what kind of jobs we're creating for these different groups of workers, including workers who have historically not had these same opportunities. I think next we have the role that we play as a standard setter, especially important at the Department of Labor as the only cabinet agency that's tasked with protecting the rights of job seekers and workers, and ensuring that there is a fair floor for compensation, health, safety, benefits for all workers, and really ensuring a fairer competition between employers in the labor market, so that businesses don't gain a competitive advantage by breaking labor law. I think third, we have the role that the government plays as a purchaser or provider provider of services. And Pranita in the first panel mentioned how this really is at the heart of the American Family Plan and the American Jobs Plan, thinking about how we can leverage the ways that we pay for healthcare services, childcare services, elder care services, all of these supports to not only help support the workers who need these services, but also ensure that we're creating good jobs in the process. And then we also are thinking carefully about the role that we play as an employer and the ways that we can set standards within our own workplace and the sort of contracting that we do in order to ensure that everyone has the same opportunity to good paying jobs that provide opportunities for advancement and are free from discrimination and are healthy and safety in all the ways that we've discussed.
Before I turn it over to Michelle and Anmal, because I'd love to hear from you both, I want to add there's a question from the audience that actually puts a finer point on my, let's add on state and local governments to think about the role that they might play. And the question is specifically, it's in general, but also asking specifically, as Alex mentioned, there's an influx of COVID recovery funds that are flowing directly to state and locals. So to the extent, Anmal, probably from your work in California and with your partners there, and Michelle and your work nationally with, I'm sure, many state and locals, if that's a question that you're able to address in your answer, I think we have folks who would be really interested to hear.
Yeah, I think there's great opportunities for states and local governments to be active in these areas. I think especially what we saw in California recently was this really unexpectedly large surplus that came through the state government, and I think we've been fortunate that the administration that we have in place in the state is directing that as much as possible to through expanded stimulus checks and things like that. And I think there is, as I mentioned, a growing there's growing efforts and campaigns within the state to address these problems with job quality. And I think that's something that I hope will continue. And I think Michelle will probably have greater insight on other states as well and the broader national picture.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are limits, obviously, to the effectiveness of voluntary employee action on improving job quality. And Susan Lambert, by the way, has a chapter dedicated to this. It's a path that needs to be pursued in tandem with policymaking at all levels, right? And so, again, for us at the National Fund, we're working to understand employers' motivation, which, again, for voluntary improving job quality is critical, and it helps us find and target employers who will act on information. But I also just want to point out, in terms of some of the gaps in that, again, I mentioned earlier, like the small, medium-sized businesses, again, that's an understudied area, and it's critical to the research, and most job quality research relies on quantitative methods, and those just aren't really appropriate for a small, medium-sized business, and we really need to dig into some rigorous case studies for that. And I think, as has been discussed earlier, federal surveys of workers and employers, those things need to be updated. Obviously, Alex has mentioned that, and Mal, I think, mentioned that as too, but those should be updated to measure the right things according to the knowledge base of the job characteristics that matter for most employee and employers outcomes. And then lastly, I would say that the federal workforce development system is really underutilized as a resource for improving job quality, mostly because DOL dollars can only be used for certain things like training workers, right? And so that how do we level the playing field in that area is a question that I would ask. And I think it's also worth discussing the appropriateness of public investments in job quality practices of private and sector employees. Again, if we're talking about changing systems and doing things at scale, what's the role of bringing that into play? So that's what I would offer.
That is fantastic. I have so many more questions like I could ask all of you all, but in the interest of letting our audience go at 5 and get on with their evenings or their second shift or whatever comes after 5 for you all and all of the folks on this panel, I will refrain from asking them and instead just thank you all for being a part of this. This has been a fantastic conversation, and I'm delighted to close out what I think has really been a wonderful day. I know I've paid close attention all day and learned a huge amount, despite being someone who spends a lot of time thinking about these issues. So there's a huge amount of value in all of this, and I hope this is only the beginning of a conversation. I know many of us have an opportunity to talk, but I'd encourage our audience to be in touch as well. I just want to remind everyone who's online that the recording of this event will be posted online. I actually don't know for sure exactly where, but I assume it'll either be on WorkRise's website or on Urban's website, and they are interrelated, so you will find us. And you should feel free to share it, rewatch it. There's lots in here. And thank you all again for joining us. And onward, we have lots of work to do. Thanks all.